Here. Good morning, and of course, thank you for joining this conference. My name is Sara, and I am a second-year master's student in Japanese studies here at Ca' Foscari, and I'm a member of the Geshin Association. Before I introduce you to our guest speakers, I would like to thank Professor Vesco for proposing and helping a lot organizing this conference. Then, of course, I express my gratitude to Professor Asato Ikeda and Professor Gunhild Borggreen for being here today. Asato Ikeda is an associate professor at Fordham University and a visiting professor at the University of Copenhagen, specializing in art, in Asian art, with a particular focus on Japan and the topics of imperialism, war, fascism, sexuality, and many more. Today, she will walk us through the visual representation of prostitutes in early modern Japanese prints and photographs, contemplating on the lives of impoverished young women. Gunhild Borggreen is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen. Her research areas span from the transcultural exchange between Denmark and Japan to the relationship between Japanese art and community, technology and gender, among many others. Her talk will focus on woodblock prints depicting scenes from the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars, in which the imaginary samurai turned into soldiers of the modern Japanese army and navy. Through these works of art, displayed at the Design Museum Denmark as part of an exhibition created by the speakers, we will gain a deeper insight on the representation of gender in Japanese art. Thank you very much, and I leave the floor to the guests.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out today. I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude to Professor Sylvia Vesco and also Sarah for making the arrangement for this trip and the event. Also, thank you to Student Association Geshin for having us. So let me see. So Gunhild Borggreen and I co-curated an exhibition titled "In Love and War" together, which is now on view at the Design Museum, which is located in Copenhagen, Denmark. And this will be on view until at least January 2025. So if you happen to have, fun to go visit Copenhagen, please take a look at the exhibition. So the exhibition displays about 60 woodblock prints from the Design Museum's own collection and 20 or so photographic materials from nearby museums such as Maritime Museum and the National Museum in Denmark. And I was responsible for the first half of the exhibition, which is the love portion. And overall, exhibition is meant to evoke the proverb, "In love and war, all is fair," indicating that in the realm of love and war, all tricks apply, or anything goes. The exhibition thus reveals the ideologically constructed nature of Japanese prints, and my section focuses on images of beautiful women whose lives were not as glamorous as the images might suggest. So I will talk for about 30 minutes, and these are the kind of things that I will be talking about. I will first talk briefly about the Edo-period and printmaking techniques, and I will focus on Ukiyo, which is a Japanese term meaning prostitutes. I will then talk about pleasure coders, in other words, the context in which these prostitutes worked, and I will conclude the presentation by touching on the realities of these women. So let me first talk about the Edo period and the development of the woodblock print technology. The print in the first section of the exhibition were made during the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868. During this period, Japan was generally at peace, thanks to the country's relative isolation and the establishment of Confucian social norms. Society maintained a strict social hierarchy that categorized the populace into 4 classes: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Before the establishment of the Edo period, Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, was an undeveloped military settlement, but it became the administrative capital. So administrative capital was located in Tokyo, or Edo, but we also have to remember that there was an imperial capital that was located in Kyoto. By the 18th century, Edo became one of the largest cities in the world with a population of more than 1 million. In comparison, I quickly kind of looked at the population of Venice in the 19th century, and it was about 125,000 people. The woodblock printing technique, initially introduced from China, developed during the Edo period. The prints were produced collaboratively by artists, when I say artists, really designers, and wood carvers, printers, and publishers. This print by Kunisada, produced in the mid-19th century, gives us an idea of what this collaborative process would have looked like. It is a mitate, meaning a parody picture, or kind of picture that plays with things. So the workers are rendered all female. In reality, though, almost all publishers and printmakers were exclusively male. So a publisher would hire an artist to make the initial design. A carver would cut a block, and the printer would apply a color and place paper over the block and rub the back of the paper to create an impression. One block could only be used for one color, so there needed to be as many blocks as there were colors in the design. So if you were to produce a print with 6 colors, you would need 6 different blocks. What we have here from the Rijksmuseum on the left is a line block or key block, which is the first block to be printed, usually with black ink, until multicolored printing was developed in the 1760s. Prints were produced in monochrome or hand-colored. And this is part of the primary Japanese primary education too. So when I was an elementary school student, this is something that you have to do, along with something like calligraphy. So this is part of Japanese art education. The woodblock prints contributed to the emergence of popular visual culture, consumed mostly by samurai and merchant class. These prints were called Ukiyo-e, and Ukiyo meant floating world and originated from Buddhist teaching on impermanence, but during the Edo period, it came to signify the pleasure-seeking behavior of living for the moment, quote unquote. For audiences in Edo, these prints were not considered fine art, because fine art as a concept really was introduced from the West in the mid-19th century, but these functioned rather as entertainment, so like movie posters of the day, kind of. Many of the prints many of the prints shown kabuki performances, actors, landscape, and beautiful women. So what I'm showing here is some of the images from the Design Museum collection that are not included in the exhibition, because the collection itself is pretty broad, and there are many more prints than we included in the exhibition this time. So this is a screenshot of Ukiyo-e.org, the largest database of ukiyo-e. There are thousands of designs produced during this period, and hopefully this is giving you some sense of how diverse these designs were and the styles were too, and how popular these prints would have been. Some images were based on actual people, but others were created out of imagination or were fictional. So we need to be cautious about taking these images as historical evidence. Even when figures were meant to be a particular individual, human representations remain rather generic, but depending on the time of production and the style of the artist, these prints' colors, composition, spatial representation, and facial bodily features of human figures are different. And when Japan opened its doors to the world in the mid-19th century, many prints were exported to the West and collected by white artists and institutions, and that included the Design Museum Denmark. And scholars usually argue that the best quality prints, Edo-period prints, are collected now in the Western museums rather than in Japan. Okay, so now I would like to move on to talk about Yujo, or the prostitutes, women for play. So moving on to the actual theme of the exhibit, prostitutes, or quote-unquote love, one of the most popular subject matters of woodblock prints was beautiful women. And some of them are fashionable townswomen, but many of those depicted were Yujo, literally women for play, which meant prostitutes who worked in licensed pleasure quarters. And I was initially trained as a specialist of modern Japanese art, 20th century, not like this is my secondary kind of field. And I always had this question of like, how do you know which one is a prostitute and which one is not? Sometimes you could tell. There's times that the status is quite ambiguous, but the ones that I will talk about today, 100%, clearly prostitutes. So high-ranking prostitutes were depicted as beautiful women wearing elaborate garment, kimono, and numerous hairpins, massive. So they have massive heads, as you can see here. In Katsushika Shunsen's prints, the woman is also identified by her professional name and the brothel she belongs to. So the inscription that you see there, those are names of the brothel and the prostitute. And Shunsen's work shows Tsukioka from the brothel Hyogo House. And Tsukioka is elegantly posing in a multi-layered kimono and outer robe with various designs, patterns, and colors. She's wearing a gigantic sash in the front, so obi in front, and that indicates how extraordinary and important she is. The print comes from a series titled 6 Jewel Rivers, Mutamagawa, which 6 prostitutes represent rivers from 6 different provinces associated with classical poems. Here, Tsukioka is likened to a river in Chofu, Musashi, which is indicated in the picture in a fan with tassels we see in the upper right. Another design from the same series is housed at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. So the one on the right is not from the Design Museum, but I'm showing you that image because they're from the same series. The work shows another prostitute named Sugawara from the brothel Tsuruya, represented as a river of Mount Koya. As you can see, their compositions are almost identical, with the woman turning gaze to the left while her body faces toward their right. We see the cloud-like shape on the top and a fan attached to a bamboo or wooden plaque and with tassels on the right. So these are different prostitutes, but their faces are hardly distinguishable. And there are other works in the exhibition that are full-length portraits of high-ranking prostitutes, and both of them are by Kitagawa Utamaro II from the early 19th century. And one of the left is Shigeoka from Okamotoya House, and on the right, one on the right is Hana Ogi from Ogi House. So instead of being compared to rivers, they are here compared to flowers. Just like the previous print by Shunsen, the women wear highly patterned layered kimono with floral motifs and geometric patterns with a large number of hairpins on their heads. The bottom part of their voluminous kimono swirls and sways to show its beautiful design, and the women almost seem to be balancing themselves on the geta sandal that are rather tall, which makes the image look dynamic and quite animated. So in the previous slide, we looked at the images by Kitagawa Utamaro II, but here this is the original Kitagawa Utamaro. Utamaro, one of the most seminal designers, invented the genre called big head picture or Ukiyo-e, presenting bust portraits, allowing closer, more intimate gaze toward the sitter. For the viewers, toward the sitter for the viewers. One on the left is Tsukioka from Hyogo House, and the other on the right is Yosoi of Matsuba House. The focus on the image is not on the extravagant kimono, but rather the prostitute's literary skills. Tsukioka is rolling up, and Yosoi is writing a letter, which is most likely a love letter for their customers. Indeed, prostitutes during the Edo period were among the most educated women in the country at the time, as they received training in calligraphy, were capable of writing poetry and letters to customers, and some were even versed in Chinese classical literature. They were expected to be educated enough to be able to hold sophisticated conversations with their guests as part of entertainment. Utamaro uses soft, curvy, yet decisive calligraphic lines for the garment, which is contrasted with the extremely thin black lines used for her hair, and especially around the face. Tsukioka from Hyogo House was one of the most popular prostitutes of the time, and a number of different designers created prints showing her. So these prints by Shunsen and Utamaro both show the same prostitute called Tsukioka. And these prostitutes, portraits of the prostitutes were produced as advertisement both for the prostitutes and also the brothel. Okay, so now I would move on to talk about the context in which these women worked. So these high-ranking prostitutes worked along with low-ranking ones in a legalized prostitution district or pleasure quarters called yukaku. The legalized prostitution began in 1618 when the Edo government approved a request from a brothel owner. The Yoshiwara pleasure quarter, the first place of this kind, was created first in Nihonbashi, which is like the eastern part of Tokyo, in 1618, but then moved to Asakusa, which is the northern part of Tokyo, in 1656, and it was called the New Yoshiwara, the image of which we are seeing here. So over there near Sensoji in Asakusa, you still have Yoshiwara over there. I didn't ask at the very beginning of the presentation, but is the lighting okay? Do you see the images? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So the new Yoshiwara pleasure quarter was created on the plot of land on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a moat and 4 plaster walls with a large central gate. Male clients reached this area on foot, by boat, or by being carried in a palanquin. And sorry. The pleasure quarter presented a fantastical, otherworldly kind of realm, a separate world filled with mystery, excitement, and thrill distinct from reality. The quarter was about 166 meters long and 55 meters wide. And as you can see in this map, there were brothels and tea houses next to each other in this rather claustrophobic space, and I will get to talk more about what tea houses meant. And Yoshiwara served the city's predominantly male population, as the alternate residence system called Sankin Kotai obliged local lords to spend their time in the capital. So the lords in the countryside have to come to Tokyo or Edo, spend 2 years and then go back, spend 2 years and go back and forth and repeat. So the population here was quite predominantly male. So a print by Tori Kiyomitsu from the mid-18th century, which the Design Museum owns in the form of modern reproduction, vividly illustrates the liveliness beyond Yoshiwara's prominent gate. And now, in case you're wondering why I said this is a modern reproduction and how we know, usually specialists look at colors and the quality of the paper to see if it comes from the 18th century or more of a modern kind of copy. The one on the left is from the Design Museum, and the one on the right is from Kobe City Museum. The color of the Design Museum one is too vivid to be of 18th century. As you can see, we decided to display the later version, the modern reproduction anyways in the exhibition, because we consider the modern reproduction as part of the history and also popularity of the Japanese woodblock prints. Now I will go back to the Design Museum one just because that's what we have in the exhibition. And on either side of the streets are brothels and tea houses. And we see 2 women near the center wearing fashionable robes with their sashes tied in front, and those are yujo. They're followed by 2 young apprentices, girls who later would become prostitutes. They're possibly sold into prostitution early in their life, or it's possible that they are daughters of the prostitutes. Behind them is an older woman with shaven eyebrows called yarite, or the handler, and some male figures still outside of the gate wear swords indicating that they're samurai. Samurai and townspeople alike, given the financial means, frequented or visited Yoshiwara, with samurai leaving their swords at the gate, creating a sense of social equity, also to have a sense of kind of safety in the space in the otherwise stratified community or society. Kiyomitsu creatively uses the brothel architecture to produce one-point perspective though the vanishing point lies awkwardly at the end wall of the quarter. Beyond the far wall, we see a rather rural, undeveloped landscape through which the residents of Edo would have traveled to reach Yoshiwara. So upon entering Yoshiwara, affluent male clients typically began their visit at tea houses or chaya, where they drank, ate, changed clothes, and spent time with entertainers like geisha. And this is where some confusion comes from, but geisha usually meant performers, so musical performers and so on, and they're different from yujo. They were not allowed to sleep with yujo's customers. After enjoying performances by geisha, the clients, if you're rich to be able to afford this kind of entertainment, they would go to proceed to brothels, which were euphemistically called greenhouses or great houses, seido in Japanese. And there they engaged in drinking and sexual interaction with yujo. The 19th century print here by Yoshiku shows the interior of a brothel in New Shimabara. So this is not Yoshiwara, but the pleasure quarter located in Kyoto. And yujo, once again, are wearing elaborate kimono. They're identified by their names in the inscription. And this image is characterized by saturated, vibrant, and contrasting colors that we didn't see in the earlier period. So this is from the mid-19th century. So we're talking about later production. So these two sets of prints are in fact part of a triptych, which is housed at Tokyo Metropolitan Library. Like Tori Kiyomitsu's print we saw earlier, this work emphasizes the depth and expansiveness of the space using the one-point perspective. There are rows and rows of rooms inside the brothel, it looks like. In order to meet a high-ranking prostitute, you would have to make a booking, and she would appear with young apprentices to welcome you. And Utagawa Kunisada's print on the left might be an image of such image. On the other hand, lower-ranking yujo would sit behind lattice windows waiting to be selected by clients, as you can see in Moronobu's print. The prosperity of the pleasure quarter was intricately linked to the economic growth of the city. By the 1760s, over 10,000 people worked in Yoshiwara in various roles, including proprietors, managers, guards, maids, and kitchen help, among others, with 2,000 working as yujo or prostitutes. A print by Utagawa Kuninao in the exhibition depicts bustling activity within the brothel from a bird's eye point of view. On the left, on the upper left side of the print, we see women wearing hairpins and combs in a small private room with a man. Their clothes are hung on the folding screen, indicating that they're engaging in sexual activity. Another yujo in the hallway in the lower left, followed by two apprentices, and another woman is on her way to her customer. When women near the center of the print busily stir rice in a large wooden tub. A man and a yujo-looking woman in the lower right are engaged in conversation, perhaps making arrangement or confirming appointments. And I must also point out that this print is part of a triptych that has been collected by Josai International University, among others. And the pleasure quarter played a very crucial role in providing employment opportunities to the residents of Edo. Sex in the Yoshiwara became the subject of erotic prints, and for self-pleasure, erotic prints called shunga were used for self-pleasure, sexual arousal, communal viewing by a couple, and sex education in some cases. These erotic prints often possess a humorous tone and typically exaggerated the size of genitals, although the one that I'm showing you is a mild one. It's not a super explicit one. And in Suzuki Harunobu's erotic print, we're invited to see an intimate moment between yujo and a male customer. Both of them are closed. The yujo reclines on a man on a futon mattress, exciting the viewer by suggesting what is about to happen. What is remarkable is the interior decoration and the design at the brothel. We see a finely painted folding screen, lacquered trays to hold sake and food, a brazier, a board game, and musical instruments, both shamisen and koto. Okay, so I will move on to talk about the last thing, which is the reality of Yujo. So in closing, I'd like to take a moment and discuss the actual lives of these women. Although in the prints, Yujo were depicted as beautiful women in elaborate kimono, it is important to note that their real lives were much more complicated and complex than their idealized images might suggest. To begin with, they did not choose the professions themselves. They worked as indentured servants with advanced payment made to their parents, not to Yujo themselves. While human trafficking and permanent indenture were prohibited, debt bondage for up to 10 years was allowed. Many faced dire fates, being vulnerable to sexually transmitted diseases and to exploitation, abuse, and violence from brothel owners and customers. Their freedoms was significantly limited within the pleasure quarters, from which they are not allowed to leave until the contract ends. The trajectories of Yujo were diverse. Yujo could work until their contract ended or were bought out by wealthy customer and ascend beyond their original social economic class. Some Yujo fell in love with less affluent customers, leading to instances of the double suicide or shinju, a theme frequently depicted in kabuki plays. Others, struggling to sustain themselves during this period with customers, faced starvation, attempted to escape, or some committed suicide. It is crucial to note that high-ranking Yujo represented only a fraction of women engaged in sex work. Low-ranking Yujo were sold at much lower prices, and many secretly practiced prostitution outside the pleasure quarters. The lives of those involved in clandestine prostitution, whether it's laundry girls or tea-serving girls, their lives would have differed significantly from the portrayal of high-ranking prostitutes in Ukiyo-e prints. The eminent scholar of Edo-period culture, Tanaka Yuko, asserts that the pleasure quarters were indispensable to the development of the market economy and cultural and artistic production of the time. However, she emphasizes that it is a system that should not and cannot be recreated today. In light of the Me Too movement, which began in 2017 and which reminds us to scrutinize power imbalances in sexual relations, we must refrain from idealizing Yujo without seriously considering the plight and hardship of the women whose voices remain largely inaccessible to us today. Most recently, artist Michelle Hartney criticized the Art Institute of Chicago's 2018 exhibition, painting the floating world ukiyo-e masterpieces from the Western collection, for omitting information about the realities of prostitution. She has published an alternative tour guide with historian Amy Stanley, whose work compellingly demonstrates how female bodies function as object of exchange in Edo's emerging market economy. So Amy Stanley's book, Selling Women, is one of the most important books that I've ever read. So I would recommend anybody to read that. Examining the dark side of the Edo period entertainment industry does not imply that we should cancel Edo period prints or cease appreciating the beauty and extraordinary craftsmanship of ukiyo-e. Understanding the socioeconomic conditions behind the works, on the contrary, makes them much more important cultural artifacts. They open up conversations not only about aesthetics, but also about the history of gender, sexuality, and treatment of women across cultures and historical contexts. The ukiyo-e demand our intellectual engagement, careful imagination, and critical reflection, in addition to artistic appreciation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and Professor Ikeda here to Venice. It's great to be back. I've been here a couple of times already. I'm Gunhild Borggreen and Associate Professor in Art History and Visual Culture at University of Copenhagen. And I specialize in Japanese art history and visual culture. And it has been a great pleasure the last year to have Asato Ikeda as a visiting professor at our department. We've been working together, making a course on Japanese art with students, bringing students to Japan on a 2 weeks excursion. And then we were invited to make this exhibition at the Design Museum in Copenhagen. They have a large exhibition, they have a large collection of woodblock prints and other Japanese objects, but they don't have any specialists employed at the museum who knows anything about Japan. So it's a kind of a contradiction in a way. So they were very happy as well that Asato and I accepted the invitation to make an exhibition, because they rarely get to show their collections of Japanese works. So we divided, as you already heard, this exhibition into 2 parts. There is a lot of overlap, we think, in the terms of how visual images convey some sort of message to the viewer, but also allures the viewer into romanticized, idealized visions of reality. So both the pleasure quarters and the women working there that you just heard, but also in terms of the war prints that I'll talk about. They have a huge collection of that in Copenhagen. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll talk about these woodblock printed war images in the Design Museum Denmark's collection, and some of them are on display at this exhibition entitled In Love and War. So here. I also have like 4 points to go through in this 30 minutes presentation. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Then I'll present some of the war prints in the exhibition. And then I'll look into how especially the Russo-Japanese War, what kind of impact that war had in Denmark. Then I'll end up by kind of arguing or concluding that Bushido as a term resonated in traditionalist, militarist, and nationalist sentiments in all of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. So let's start with this concept of the Bushido. Oh, this is too early. Sorry. The Meiji period from 1868 to 1912 was a historical period of huge political, social, and cultural change in Japan, as I'm sure you already know. Japan had been in voluntary isolation, more or less, for over 200 years, but due to pressure from the United States and several European nations, Japan opened its borders to the outside world in the 1850s. Japan became engaged in a complex process of establishing a modern nation state. And as I will return to later, this process of nation building was also taking place in Europe at the same time. So it's not specific for Japan at this era. The first part of the Meiji period was characterized by turbulent change in the Japanese society, with all things new from the West. By the end of the Meiji period, that is in the 1890s, however, a movement began of restoring Japanese interest and pride in their own cultural heritage and traditions. And one such so-called tradition was the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior. And I here draw from the excellent research by historian Oleg Benish and his book from 2014 entitled Inventing the Way of the Samurai, Nationalism, Internationalism, and Bushido in Modern Japan. As Benish points out, the concept of Bushido was an invented tradition, constructed in the late 19th century as a romanticized and nostalgic longing towards a past that had actually never existed in reality. Benish points out how there were many Japanese intellectuals in the Meiji period and later who contributed to formulate the ideologies of Bushido. The initial formulation of this invented tradition was based on the notion of European chivalry and knighthood, an equally romanticized nostalgia for medieval mythology that was particularly strong in England in the late 19th century. Just think about the myths concerning King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, here visualized in the painting The Death of King Arthur by James Archer, an artist of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. We can say that the invention of medievalism in Europe and Bushido in Japan had some parallels in the way in which they privilege nostalgic idealism over historical specificity in its representation of a medieval past. In Japan, we can see romanticized ideals of martial warfare depicted in woodblock prints from the late Meiji period, such as this image, which is also in the exhibition by Toyohara Chikonobu, entitled The Battle of Komaki from 1898. It is depicting historical warrior figures with distinct elements of a samurai spirit, such as bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice. So in his book on the invention of Bushido, Oleg Benesch presents a detailed analysis of the many Japanese contributions to the establishing these ideologies of Bushido. For the period around 1900, the concept of what Benesch calls imperial Bushido, promoted by the philosopher Inoue Tetsujiro, had a large impact on the Japanese population, educational system, and military training. So as Benesch points out, and I quote here, the philosopher Inoue Tetsujiro was instrumental in developing the government-sanctioned and emperor-focused imperial Bushido that became a highly influential ideology from the Russo-Japanese War onward, unquote. And he continues, and I quote, Bushido came to play a central role in military and civilian education, especially in the growth of spiritual education programs used to indoctrinate troops with the desired virtues of loyalty and self-sacrifice, unquote. As Benesch argues, one of the factors behind the Bushido boom in the late Meiji period was a significant change in Japan's relation to China. For Japan, China had been the political and cultural center since prehistoric times. By the 1890s, however, growing tensions between Japan and the Qing dynasty in China, combined with Japan's growing national confidence, led to armed conflicts. In the first Sino-Japanese War, and I say first because there's a second one in the 1930s, but the first Sino-Japanese War was about control of Korea, which had been a vassal state under China. A peasant revolt within Korea in 1894 prompted the Chinese Qing dynasty to send troops to Korea, and Japan perceived this as a breach of a mutual agreement between China and Japan not to interfere in Korean affairs, and Japan therefore declared war on China on August 1st, 1894. And you can see on this map, Japan, like the pink islands on the right, and Korea in the middle, and China and Manchuria with yellow. And you can sort of see in this map how the control of ports of Korea and Manchuria was very important for controlling the entire region around the Yellow Sea. So the battles in the Sino-Japanese War did not take place in Japan, but in Korea and Manchuria, and in the waters along the coastlines. So here's I'm gonna zoom in on this part of the map, and this is a detailed map of the theater of war during the Sino-Japanese War, and I'll use this as to indicate the locations of the battles that are depicted in the prints in the Design Museum collection. So some of the first battles took place here in the south of the Korean peninsula at Seongwang and Asan on July 29th, 1894. And this is also where I'm going to go into the second part, where I present some of the prints from the exhibition. In this print by Kobayashi Kiyochiga, we see a Japanese cavalry crossing the Ansong River in the early hours of July 28th to attack the Chinese defense. In some cases, like here, we see individual officers' names written in small cartouches on the print as a means to glorify their bravery and their commanding skills. In this print by Mizuno Toshikata, we see the Japanese attack on Seongwang on the following day. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a group of artists and journalists. They're all wearing very modern outfit and hats. And this group signify the importance of news media of the time as a means to celebrate these victories of the Japanese army. And of course, also the artist actually producing these war prints, which was a huge commercial success in Japan, encouraging the patriotism of the Japanese army. And the presence of these modern-looking journalists and artists in the image is also a way of authenticating the image itself, the subject matter of the image. So these were the first battles of a new modern Japanese army. And the images show that the soldiers were trained in lining up information and following the orders of their commanders. They all wear Western-style uniforms and carry state-of-the-art weapons. We can see the notion of Bushido at play in the modern war prints through the depiction of discipline, order, and loyalty in the Japanese army, in contrast to the chaotic and uncivilized behavior of the enemy troops. So after the first battle, the Japanese troops pursued the Chinese army and engaged in battle at the city of Pyongyang on September 15, 1894. And this print by Ogata Gekko, we see how the main division of the Japanese Imperial Army attacked from the southwest during the early morning of September 15th. And following a 12-hour battle, the Chinese actually repulsed this force. And here's another print by Okuda Koto depicting the same situation, and we get here a sense of how fierce and exhaustive the battles must have been for both parties. The artist Baido Kokunimasa depicts another angle of the Battle of Pyongyang, because while General Oshima made a frontal attack, Lieutenant General Nozu sent out some of his men in a pincer movement to surprise the Chinese front from the left flank, provoking a general panic and a lot of Chinese soldiers jumping off the cliffs. You can see that in the left part of the image here. It appears that over 2,000 soldiers lost their lives during this battle. And during the evening of the September 15th, many troops tried to flee for the coast and the border city of Uiju on the lower reaches of the Yalu River, but here they were attacked by Japanese troops, and the Japanese army won the battle in the end. And in this print by Kobayashi Kiyuchika, we can also see how these war prints were admired, not just for the subject matter they depicted, but also for their aesthetic quality. They really delve into beautiful colors and forms in these kind of prints. And here's another print by Mizuno Toshikata. It might be depicting the same night scene that we just saw. And this print by Mikata Toshihide shows how the Japanese army has taken Chinese prisoners of war during the Battle of Pyongyang. As in many other war images, the purpose is to dehumanize the enemy as a means to legitimize the war. And here the artist depicted Japanese officers in the right-hand side as disciplined and modern in their well-fitting Western-inspired uniforms, while the Chinese prisoners of war on the left are depicted as primitive and old-fashioned, dressed in loose, fluttering robes and traditional hairstyle and hats. And the Chinese prisoners are on their knees, begging for their lives, while the Japanese officers seem to consider to spare them from execution, implying that Japan, as a civilized nation, followed international rules of warfare. So in the meantime, Japan and China also engaged in war at sea. So many of the war prints depict naval battles. And this print by Mizuno Toshikata shows Japanese naval officers meeting on a ship on September 13th, 1894, to plan a strategy for controlling the Yellow Sea. And on one of the first and most crucial sea battles took place on September 17th, 1894, in the waters around the mouth of Yalu River and around the island of Haiyan. It was the largest sea battle at all in the whole war, with more than 25 vessels of different kinds involved, and the battle was depicted in numerous prints. And here you see where most of these prints I've shown until now have had 3 sheets of paper assembled into one large composition. This print by Okada Gekko is a rare example of 4 sheets of paper in one composition. And you can see up to 6 sheets sometimes, a very long composition. And the Chinese ships were black and the Japanese ships were white. And this also made a good effect. This contrast made a good effect in the prints as well. And here you see another print from the same battle by the artist Kado. He has zoomed in on a situation where Chinese seamen are falling into the waves after the ship has been hit. And the Japanese naval officers on the approaching boats on the left, you can see they have their swords drawn, but we don't know if they're actually going to rescue the Chinese sailors or kill them. And this print by Nakamura Shuko is one of the most spectacular compositions among the war prints, with the Japanese flagship Matsushima on the right, passing the Chinese armored cruiser Z1 on the left, which has been hit by a torpedo. And although several of the Japanese warships also suffered damage during this battle, artists never depict this in their prints. So the first Sino-Japanese War officially ended with a peace treaty at Shimonoseki in April 1895. Japan gained control of Taiwan, as well as the cities of Port Arthur and Wei Highway. However, 3 European nations, Russia, Germany, and France, had intervened in the Sino-Japanese peace treaty and demanded that Japan cede the Liaodong Peninsula with the important harbor of Port Arthur to China. Japan was pressed to agree, but when Port Arthur shortly after was taken over by Russia, Japan began to prepare for more military confrontations. So in February 1904, that's 10 years after the Sino-Japanese War, Japan attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in a surprise attack, thereby starting a war against Russia that lasted until September 1905. Here too, the battles took place in Korea and Manchuria, and there were many civilian casualties. And as you can see on this map, the X's mark the main battles of the war in Port Arthur, in the area of Mukden, and the final sea battle at Tsushima between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. So this print by an unknown artist depicts a battle of Japanese troops entering Seoul in February 1904, where Japan declared war against Russia. And here's a print by the artist Kyoko showing the initial surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on February 8th, 1904. And the Russian fleet was protected by shore batteries of the harbor, and they did not leave the port for a long time, resulting in Japan's siege of Port Arthur that lasted from April 1904 until January 1905. One of the most effective Japanese military weapons in the war was underwater mines, submerged in the ocean at strategic places. And this print by Gakyojin shows how on April 13th, 2 Russian warships tried to slip out of the harbor of Port Arthur, but hit Japanese underwater mines. The Russian flagship Petropavlovsk sank almost immediately with 700 men, including Vice Admiral Stepan Makarov, one of the best Russian military strategists in the war. So Makarov's death was a major military and moral loss for the Russian Navy. And on this print, you can see Makarov depicted in a very heroic pose in the center of the composition, defending his ship and his men in the midst of a chaotic scenery. And this is a very different way of depicting the enemy compared to how the Chinese enemy were represented in earlier prints. And this, another print from Yasuda Hampo of the same situation, shows a highly unusual view underwater, like 2/3 of the print is underneath the sea. And we can see how the Japanese mines attached with rope to heavy objects on the seabed, and that one of them has exploded a hole in the bottom of the ship. And on the bottom part of this image, it's very difficult to see, even in the exhibition display, but there's an English text printed in silver print at the bottom, and it signifies that the Japanese print publishers also had an international audience in mind with these war images. There was a large international attention to the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese victory surprised many observers, and it shifted the power relations in Asia, or both in the Asian region, but also on the global level. And a large number of military attachés and war correspondents, including many from Denmark, covered the battlefields in Manchuria, following both the Russian and the Japanese army and reporting back on military strategies and technologies. So therefore, I just now turn to look at look at the reception and the impact of the Russo-Japanese War in Denmark. And I give these examples from Denmark, but I'm sure that there are many parallels from this in other countries in Europe. So maybe you find this interesting to look how this influenced, for example, Italy at this time. So the Danish newspaper, daily newspaper Politiken, began publishing Ekstrablad, or an extra sheet, with telegrams from the Russo-Japanese battle scenes from February 1904. And most of these are advertisements, but the article starts down here in the corner. And this extra sheet later became the tabloid newspaper Ekstrabladet, which still exists today in Denmark. Military reports were transformed into popular entertainment in bi-weekly magazine publications like this one, Krigen i Østen, en illustreret beretning om den russisk-japanske krig i 1904, meaning the war in the East, an illustrated story about the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. It was a translation into Danish of a British magazine. But there was also this one, Fra Krigsskuepladsen, from the Theatre of War, in Illustrated Family Journal. Both of these magazines featured hundreds of images ranging from maps and portraits of both Japanese and Russian officers, as well as photos and drawings of ships, battlegrounds, and soldiers in combat, like this one. Books on the topics came out, such as the military advisor Balthasar Münter, who had lived in Japan for a number of years in the 1880s and 90s as an agent for the British warship company Armstrong. With his military background, he was able to give detailed analysis of the situation in the war, and he gathered his material in the book Krigen mellem Japan og Rusland, The War Between Japan and Russia, from 1904. So let me now continue to discuss a little bit how this Japanese concept of Bushido resonated in Danish and other European countries in the early 20th century, to return to the kind of the beginning notion of this Bushido concept. So while Denmark had historical links to Russia, the Danish media and population did not necessarily cheer for Russia. In fact, like many other Europeans, people in Denmark were surprised that the small and rather unknown nation like Japan could defeat first China and now Russia. This caricature from Münter's book I just showed you the cover of, illustrating Russia as the barbaric Goliath and Japan as the tiny David in a battle, where the weak overcomes all odds and conquers the powerful. While some critics and media voiced concern of the so-called yellow peril, others were enthusiastic about the military strategy of the Japanese Imperial Army and glorified what they perceived as unprecedented fighting spirit and self-sacrifice of the Japanese soldiers. Sorry, this was the wrong direction here. The controversial Danish author and national militarist Carl Larsen wrote the book Japansk Ånd, or Japanese Spirit, in 1909, in which he celebrates the bravery of Japanese soldiers and officers in the Russo-Japanese War. His book was translated into Swedish, Japan in Strid, Japan in Battle, 1911, and into German, Japan im Kampf, Japan in Battle, also from 1911. Larsen believed in militarism and discipline as a cure for the so-called democratic disease that he believed prevailed in modern European societies. The Norwegian Rear Admiral Jacob Børresen, and you have to remember, Norway was a part of Denmark at this time, so he's also kind of a representative of the Danish vision here. He wrote about the war in his 3-volume book, Den Russisk-Japanske Krig, the Russo-Japanese War from 1904, and he mentions Bushido specifically. In a chapter on Japanese Bushido, he writes, and I quote, "Bushido is a fruit of the peculiar Japanese moral doctrine, which from the caste of the samurai has spread throughout the entire people and permeated the army and navy from the highest commander to the privates," unquote. Børresen focuses on the Japanese soldiers' apparent willingness to sacrifice their lives on the battlefield. And he writes, quote, "What strikes a European reading about the battles of the Japanese is first and foremost their peculiar fearlessness of death. A European is also brave, but behind his bravery, there is a promise of fame, of reward, of an order, a title, a marshal's baton. The Japanese only await and desire death. When their mothers and wives send them to war, it is without a thought that they shall return. To die is only a triumph for them," unquote. So in the same vein as Carl Larsen, Børresen too believes that the Japanese samurai ethics can be adapted by Europeans and provide a better life, namely by emphasizing human duties rather than human rights, referring to the Japanese sense of duty towards their nation and their emperor, or at least what was perceived as this sense of duty. For Danish writers and critics such as Carl Larsen, Jacob Børresen, and others, what they admired about the Japanese army and navy in the Russo-Japanese War was closely linked to the nationalist sentiment in Denmark in the second half of the 19th century. Denmark had been at war with Prussia, or Germany, in 1848 to 1851, and again in 1864 against both Prussia and Austria, concerning nationhood and independence in the southern part of Denmark, especially the Duchy of Schleswig. Denmark had lost the war and had to give up a large part of Danish territory to Germany. So the sentiment in the later part of the 19th century was to celebrate Danish nationhood despite the defeat, and to create a narrative of a united Danish nation with soldiers who would fight for their country and their king. And the painting here by the Danish artist Otto Bakke is a portrait made in 1887 of the Danish colonel Max Müller at the Battle of Sankelmark, one of the final battles of the 1864 war. And the narrative about this officer highlights his patriotic virtues and self-sacrifice. And this can be regarded as a kind of Danish version of Bushido, installing the idea of the brave soldiers who are willing to sacrifice their lives for their nation. So we can say that the Bushido ethics was invented in Japan on basis of European romanticized ideals of chivalry and knighthood, and then transferred back to Europe especially during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. So today, 120 years after the Russo-Japanese War, Russia is involved in another war, and a serious armed conflict is unfolding in Gaza, resulting in thousands of civilian casualties. And in Denmark and elsewhere, militarism seems to be on the rise, and thousands of young people are asked to do military service for their country. And this is also why it was very important for Professor Ikeda and myself to include an anti-war statement in the In Love and War exhibition, because you see all these terrible war prints. But the anti-war statement is installed in the exhibition as a loudspeaker near the exit of the exhibition space, where visitors can listen to a poem being read in Japanese, English, and Danish. It is a poem by the Japanese author Yosano Akiko, who in 1904 wrote this message to her brother, who was conscripted to the Japanese army in the war against Russia. "Do not give your life," the poet says. "Do not kill and die." So when visitors walk through the exhibition and enjoy the beauty of these Japanese woodblock prints, we also invite them to stop and listen to Yosano Akiko's poem, and we hope that you, as well as the audiences, will take a moment to reflect upon warfare and how to stop the present enarmament and militarist escalation. So thank you very much.